Qué buen dato.
That's my hair. Where's makeup? Makeup. I know, that's enough. Give me.
Ok, fermentistas, aquí estamos con Raphael. How are you, Raphael?
Hola.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
Muy bien.
¿Dónde estamos ahora?
Estamos en Enlightenment Wines Meadery. Es una, no sé, ¿se dice meadery?
I don't know. I mean, un lugar donde hacen hidromiel.
Okay, hidromiel.
Hidromiel es mead, hidromiel.
Yeah.
Or aguamiel, también se dice aguamiel.
Well, so is that going to be okay?
Oh yeah, that's
Okay.
fine. So,
my name is Raphael Lyon. I'm the founder and co-owner of Enlightenment Wines Meadery and Honeys, which is our tasting room, and it's located next door to the meadery or winery. We consider mead a kind of wine, so sometimes we use those words.
great. So, what is mead for those people that are watching this video and haven't heard of mead before?
So mead is a kind of wine, but it's instead of using grapes, you start with honey. So just like there's rice wine in the world, there's barley wine, there's fruit wines, and there's honey wine. And honey wine is called mead, and it's what we make here. One thing to know about mead that's important is that it's not just honey. So while we're fermenting the sugars out of the honey typically to make alcohol, we're often using other fruits and herbs alongside that.
Okay, so mead can be a carrier for plant medicine, like the medicinal qualities of that plant and maybe the flavor qualities of that plant are infused into the mead.
Right. So one of the things that you'll find is if you look at the history of alcohol making, not just mead but also grape wine, almost throughout every different culture who makes alcohol, and it's pretty much all human cultures, there's a really close relationship between making medicine and making alcohol.
Right.
So when the Romans brought wine into their battles, they weren't using it to party with, they were using it to clean wounds or to sterilize their water. And in the same way that because we didn't have distillation until relatively recently, a few hundred years ago, almost all herbs would have been tinctured in different kinds of wine, and mead was a big part of that.
So what you're doing here is a wild fermented mead. Can we talk about what that means and why it's so special? Because there's not a lot of meaderies doing what you all are doing here at Enlightenment.
So in the greater wine world, when you think about people making wine out of grapes, or any of the mead that was made really until like the 1960s, right? So 10,000 years of mead would have all been what we call spontaneously fermented, which means that the yeast that is used to ferment the mead is actually brought in on the honey. And that makes a certain amount of sense if you think about it. Like the yeast that's the happiest with honey are the ones that are going to survive in the honey and carry themselves through from the flowers to the bees. So we feel that the yeast that's kind of naturally occurs with the honey is also best suited for making the mead. And that's not just like an abstract idea. In practice, what we find is that when you use spontaneous fermentation, you're using a cascading series of different organisms, of different yeasts. So there's some yeasts that will die at 5% alcohol, but they produce like a wonderful floral aroma. And then another yeast will take its place, and another yeast will take its place until there's a stable colony in there that's more alcohol tolerant. So when you use spontaneous fermentation, you're also adding complexity to the product.
Interesting. So in the home brewing community, as you know, a lot of people are just brewing beer, maybe, and then they jump from beer to wine. So they have this idea that a wild fermented or spontaneous fermented mead would be, you know, too wild. So maybe you create a product that is not consistent enough. Or maybe there's this fear of creating off flavors because there might be some bacteria present. You know, so I think that finding a commercial meadery that's doing this spontaneous fermentation is something that's really special. Do you find that your meads are consistent, like if throughout the years?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing is that let's think about the similarity between beer and wine. On one level, like all alcohol is made the same way, right? You have a yeast that ferments some kind of sugar.
Right.
And that's going to be true no matter whether or not you're making whiskey or you're making beer or making wine. On the other hand, if you look at the way that beer is actually produced versus the way that wine is produced, not just now, but historically, I mean, beer has always been made in factories. There's no home brewer out there who doesn't wish they have a bigger equipment and more control, right? And typically, like, beer gets better when you make it in bigger batches and you have more temperature control and you can be more precise. Beer was made in factories from the beginning. It was made in Egypt in factories, right? So the oldest beer you would have found breweries and big like vats and made like bakeries. Like you can break bread at home, but there's a lot of efficiency to having a bigger oven and making bread at a certain size.
Right.
That's not really true for wine. Wine typically is something that would be made in a farm at home. Mead also was always made in smaller quantities at home, and there's a few reasons for that. Again, until very recently, if you wanted to drink beer, it needed to be pretty sterile and drunk pretty fast because they didn't have the knowledge necessarily to understand sterility, and they had a practice that allowed for it, but basically beer wasn't the kind of thing, no one drank 10-year-old beer until very, very recently, right? But people have been drinking 10-year-old wine forever, and so why is that? And the fundamental difference between the two is that if you wanted to make something that would last, meaning that it would preserve for over time, you had to make something that had a higher alcohol level because a lot of the preservation activity is simply done by the alcohol. So to do that, you need to get to about 10, 11, 12%. Once you hit about 12% alcohol, then your wine's very stable in the sense that it's not going to turn to vinegar. It's very hard to make vinegar out of 12% alcohol wine.
Right.
But if you have a 6% alcohol wine, 5% alcohol, that thing's going to turn to vinegar really fast without sulfites.
Right.
So if you're a winemaker, you have a totally different relationship to like the environment and organisms. It's much more like having a garden than it is like doing chemistry. So all wine was made in this way forever until very recently, which means that they would use spontaneous fermentation. They would ferment until all the sugars were gone, more or less, unless you have a very specific situation. But basically, if you ferment out all the sugars and just produce alcohol, you're not artificially adding nutrients so that there's like a lot of nutrients left over. You pretty much have it's not sterile, it's alive, but it's stable. So if you can do that, that's how all mead would have been made. And there was two ways to do that. You could either make a dry mead, which requires some precision, right? You need to know whether or not there's any sugar left, you have to have the right amount, and you need a hydrometer for that so that you can measure how much initial honey you have. Or you can make a really sweet mead. You put a lot of honey in it, it gets extremely alcoholic, and you sit on it for 5 years. In Poland, they literally don't drink their mead at least for 5 years. So as a mead maker at home, if you want to make something that's actually sort of authentic to the history of mead making, you're either going to make a really sweet mead that's very strong, which is a little bit hard, I don't want to drink that myself, or you make a dry mead, and that's what we do here. So in a lot of ways, even though we're a commercial operation, we're just multiplying the activity of having a barrel of mead, which any homemaker could do and drink over the course of the year, and it just have more of them. The second question has to do with consistency.
Right.
Consistency is really a question that is a production of factories, right? Factories need to be consistent, right? So if you go to Kolsch, if you want a Kolsch, right, and you go to Utrecht and you want to have like a nice beer that's been made a certain way for 300 years, you don't go in there, they don't have 100 beers, they have 2 beers. They have the light beer and the brown beer, right? And that light beer needs to taste the same for the guy who's 100 years old as for the guy who's 20 years old, right? And because it's a factory, consistency is really important. In the wine world, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is your reputation, meaning year by year you produce great wine. Character, meaning that within that reputation, you have you have interesting things. So maybe you're using Chardonnay grapes, but it is something special about your region that produces something special, right? And then the third thing is that your wine's alive. So there is no expectation that it's going to stay the same. In fact, most wines, great wines, they get better. So for us, I could choose, I mean, it's not hard to repeat what you do year to year.
Right.
But why not make it better? So every year we're trying to make it better. And I think that's how you get better. And I think that, for example, the Floralia that is in the bar right now, we only have like 6 bottles left. It's great, people love it. But I'm gonna make it even better this year. And so you do that by changing some things. Another thing is that when you have a wine that's alive, it's actually more stable than a wine that's dead. Because if you put, so you make a, if you do what the homebrew shop who wants to sell you things tells you, they're going to want you to sulfite your wine, they're going to want you to filter your wine. And it's true, like in some ways the wine will be brighter, it'll be cleaner. If you have mediocre products, you can adjust them so it tastes okay, you can flavor it. But why not just start with really good, high quality honey and skip it?
Okay, we're good. Where did we leave off?
And that's why we must smash the state.
And yeah, voila. Okay, so mead is honey and water mixed together. So can you take us through,
Well, I would say mead is any fermentation where a significant part of the sugars come from honey.
Okay.
So, like I said, apple mead, blackberry mead, cherry mead. We're fermenting these juices with honey.
Right.
And in the case of the black currant mead, which you like quite a bit, as we were talking, if you think about it, like black currants are this amazing fruit. They have a lot of tannins and a lot of acids that are really interesting, a lot of flavor, but they have almost no sugar. So you use the honey, in that case, to bring the starting sugar up so that you have enough alcohol to preserve it. If you were to just try and ferment the black currants, it's too acidic. It's just not, it's too intense for the yeast, so you wouldn't really get anywhere. Or if you did, you'd end up with a low alcohol thing that almost immediately turned to vinegar.
Right.
Which is why you find black currant meads all around the world.
Right.
It's just like a very easy, common relationship. Same thing with cherries and raspberries. A lot of these berries are great for mead.
So you get honey and water and other ingredients, and they come here, and then what happens?
Okay, so I'll show you. So the honey comes in these buckets like this.
Okay.
I can show you. This is a bucket of...
And I understand that all your honey comes from the same... Oh,
right. So this is raw honey, and you'll notice on the top here, see all these little specks and this sort of white stuff?
Right.
See that?
Oh, yes.
So this is bee pollen, but this is where the yeast is. And I say that because the top of this surface is going to have a little bit more water from the air. And my guess is that this is mostly where the yeast live. And so we're very careful with the lids to use that as the inoculant. Although I'm sure there's yeast trapped in here as well. I think most of it lives on the surface. So we take these buckets, and
all of your honey comes from the same farm, is that correct?
Yeah, these guys. They're great. They do all raw honey. We've been working with them for a long time. And then we'll mix it up in, I can show you the thing. But basically, for a while we used to just stir it. It's hard to mix all the water and all the honey at the same time. So we mix the honey up with some water, and then it's thin enough, and then we pump it into here, and then we add the rest of the water. And at that time, that's a good time if you're using herbs to make like tea, because unlike grape wine, you don't really ever want to heat your wine, right? Whether it's honey wine or grape wine. But because mead starts out as water, you can boil that water. Not before you start, you're not going to hurt anything. So it's a great time to do your infusions, especially some of your more tannic things, get them into the water, and then bring them into here. And then this is where this is just a big container. It's basically a bucket. Not that complicated. It has a thing for you to clean it out. We have a heating element in here if we want to bring the temperature up a little bit.
Okay.
Which can help dissolve the water, but we don't like to let the honey get that hot.
Right.
Just hot enough to just to dissolve it a little bit. And then if we want to rack it, we use that. And you can take a sample here, but basically this is a big bucket. And then once it's, after like about 10 days usually, fingers crossed, it's fermenting, and then we'll pump it out of that into a barrel.
Okay.
And it spends most of its life in the barrel, about a year.
So it goes, in that year, is it ever racked from one barrel to another barrel?
Sure, yeah. So there's two philosophies about it. You can age on the lees, which is done for certain wines, where they purposely age on the lees. Now, one of the big differences between using a carboy and using a barrel, or using one of these, is that as the container gets bigger, there's a lot more pressure on the yeast. So if you want to come in the back, I can show you what lees are.
Okay, great. That's interesting. I've read a lot of things like, some people say you should never age on lees, and some people say that it's okay.
It depends on the yeast,
right?
Right? So, we talk a lot about wild yeast versus commercial yeast. So commercial yeast are like, like we were talking, they're dogs or horses. They've been bred to do things. And mostly what they've been bred to do is produce a lot of alcohol really fast and then die and sink.
Right.
So all those things, produce alcohol and then sink. Wild yeast aren't necessarily bred to sink, right? So sometimes they're cloudy a little bit and they take longer to sink. So for example, this is quite a bit of lees. This might be lees from a whole barrel. But we're just seeing if we can get some leftover out of this, or we'll make vinegar, or we'll use it to top something off. But like for example here, you can kind of see down here, like this, how much lees is produced from this. So the question is like in this container, it's not a big deal. You actually have a lot of surface area. The problem is if you have a lot of lees, if you have this, if you got 4 inches of lees, and you're at the bottom of 500 gallons, there's a lot of weight. And now you're pushing that, and you're compacting it, and you're forcing the oxygen out. And at that point, some strange things start to happen in there, right? Weird chemicals, weird organisms, strange flavors, because it's under a lot of pressure. So for the home brewer, or the home winemaker, because you're not brewing, unless you're boiling, we're not boiling, right? I would say don't worry about it so much, but racking it helps clear the wine.
Okay.
So if you're not going to filter at the end, racking it is one of the ways. You rack every 3 or 4 months. Now, I wouldn't stress about it. I think some yeast taste good on the lees. Some yeast don't. The best thing to do is taste it.
Yeah, your palate is your guide.
Yeah, totally. And so if your lees or your yeast taste really bitter, then that's probably going to contribute bitterness to your mead. But if your lees taste bready and nice and they add body and texture, that's good. In the commercial wine world, when you age on the lees on purpose, they'll typically stir them up periodically to make sure there's none of that like crush on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just two questions. You said earlier that this might be lees from a whole barrel. That's because this is like what doesn't fit in the barrel you'll put in here, and that's
because basically we'll rack all the barrels, right? And then there'll be like a gallon of sort of muddy water at the bottom, but we don't throw it out. We'll combine all of it and fill up a thing, and then eventually it'll clear, and we'll use that for something else. So we don't have to throw out any wine.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then also we talked about but we talked about before that making a vinegar with a 12% mead would be difficult because it's more stable. And I've read some anything above 9% would have to be diluted. So if y'all are going to make a vinegar, would you do that?
Well, vinegar is a whole other world. But
would you dilute your mead?
No.
No.
We don't.
Okay.
You don't really want to dilute your vinegar until it's done.
Okay.
And partially because it takes up a lot of space. Now, that's not to say it's not really hard to do. So part of it is that people spend most of their time obsessing that their wine is going to turn into vinegar.
Right.
Until they try and make vinegar, and it's not that easy, actually. The thing about vinegar is they need to be in a very acidic environment. So you can have a 12% alcohol turn into vinegar if you start with half and half vinegar. You have to start with a huge amount of
starter.
Yeah, usually like at least a third or a quarter. And then you can slowly add. Because think about it, traditionally no one added water when they made their vinegar. They would have a barrel of vinegar and they would top it off with wine. They would just keep adding wine slowly to it. And as long as it's mostly vinegar, you can grow that. Again, it's like you have a garden and things have to get acclimated, and then once you have a healthy ecosystem,
right,
you can do a lot of things.
Right.
So like the yeast you start out with can't handle 12% alcohol. You can't just dump it in 12% alcohol with some honey and expect it to keep fermenting. You can't do it.
Yeah.
But you can start it with no alcohol and slowly acclimate it to 12% alcohol, and then it will continue. Because your yeasts are evolving, you know, as they go. They're going through, you know, dozens and dozens of generations. I was going to show you. So you asked about the yeast. Do you do anything with them? And so we did some air dry stuff.
Oh, so this is dehydrated leaves?
Yeah, these are dehydrated, probably cherry leaves.
Wow.
So they're kind of like a superfood. Because, you know, leaves have all this B12.
Yeah, a lot of B vitamins.
Yeah, so they taste kind of like a energy bar.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So is this for your personal consumption? Or
I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out what to do with it. But
yeah.
I want to try it. It's got a kind of rubbery, you know, it's got some like flavors I don't love. But it seems like something that could be like used as a fertilizer or like a garnish or something. It's really malty. It tastes like chocolate and stuff.
It's great, actually. It tastes,
Yeah.
I like it. I mean, it could definitely be part, if you dehydrated it with, I don't know, coconut and cacao or something.
Yeah.
It could be part of an energy bar.
Totally.
Oh, interesting.
It's the only thing we throw out right now, so, you know, that's the nice thing about making mead. Oh yeah, so anyway, we use this thing to stir it.
Okay.
But, you know, we used to use a paddle, but this is nice. So we'd stir it.
Is this where you mix the honey and water?
Yeah, and that's how we get a little air in it. Like, you know, we're talking about it needs a little
Right.
air in the beginning. So we aerate it as much as we can, and then
So you're mixing there and you're putting that mix here.
in there, adding water, going through the fermentation, and then it goes in barrels and basically just sits there.
Okay.
Now, if we're using herbs or fruit, you know, they'll come in at different points, typically as early as possible.
Okay. When you say as early as possible, do you mean in this, our version of the big bucket, or are you talking
like if you're going to make an apple mead, it doesn't make sense to make like a cider and then make a mead and then blend
Mix
them together. They take a while to knit. It's better to start them off together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. But some of the botanical ingredients you're adding, you know, once it's already been in the barrel.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it really depends.
Depends
I
on
mean,
the
there's all
plant.
kinds of things. Like, so, you know, these are like American New England juniper. And see, they're smaller. They're a little bit sweeter. Oops. So, like, I'll forage these in the fall, and we'll add them late in the infusion. But here, if you want to try one, they're really good.
Yeah.
So Native Americans used to just grind these up and make pancakes and stuff out of them. They're really wonderful flavor, but they wouldn't survive for a year. They're too light.
They're wonderful. So,
Whereas, like, this is an elderberry. These are dried elderberry. Something like this you'd want to put in right in the beginning.
right.
Other things need heat to release them. You just have to experiment, really.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people have that question, like, what proportion should I use for, you know, but it really also depends on your palate as well.
I would say that, like, when you have to guess, I know this is sort of crazy, but virtually almost everything ends up being about 1 gram to the gallon.
1 gram to the gallon?
Yeah, which is, like, you know, it's a place to start. It's a good place to start.
So 1 gram of dried elderberries to a gallon of water?
It's a place to start.
Okay, yeah, it's a
But,
good...
you know, I use, you know, we have, like, I'm doing tests all the time. These are, like, you know, we have a whole herb library on the roof of different herbs that you can't really get commercially.
Right.
So, like, this is a lemon mint marigold, right? So this is what they call Mexican marigold sometimes, but it's an infusion of a flower.
Okay.
I'm doing for dinner. You know, we have 15 of these. I'll take notes, really small amounts. You know, and maybe that needs to go with this, which is like a lime geranium, scented geranium. Does your camera have smell-o-vision?
Oh, yes, it has.
Yeah.
Let's see. Mm-hmm.
Have you tried these? They're from the roof. They're good.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, so the roof is more of like in the garden that allows you to experiment. You know, you're like, it's not necessarily, because most of your botanical ingredients, your plants, you're foraging yourself or you're getting from local farms.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
It's the roof is not big enough to.
No, but for example, like there's like 100 different kinds of lavender, but I don't know. You know, I can only buy 1 or 2, but like if there's one I really liked, and I can encourage the farmer to grow it, or we could grow it next year or something. But it's a way to like learn about when to pick them, also how to dry them.
Right.
Because a lot of stuff you can get dried, but it's not dried well. So, and some things, you know, it's kind of very long range thinking, sort of.
Yeah.
You know. But, yeah. Anyway, so this is the lemon mint marigold,
Okay.
or the lemon gem marigold,
Beautiful.
and you can smell that.
Oh yeah. There we go. The camera's smelling too.
Yeah, camera smelling.
Oh,
Some of
cool.
these are historic plants that have been used like in mead making, and you can't really buy them, or you know, I want to kind of meet them up close. And then you know, we also have some plants like that have like kind of been historically associated with herbalism. You know, that sort of cross the line. Because again, like most of the herbs that would have been used in mead making, they typically have a second life as a medicinal herb, or a primary life. So this is like yarrow. So yarrow is like one of the early bittering agents for beer. It's used in practically all the English meads. And
Pre-hops.
yeah, it's a pre-hop. So it's antibacterial. So you can see from down here into the storage room a little bit. Yeah, I don't know what you can see down there, but. And then
There we go.
and then this is for we do events and things up here, and then
Right.
we've got this is where we have the kind of the library. So like here you can see all these different kinds of rosemary, which is a plant that's got a really interesting history
Nice.
and use. And then there's all kinds of stuff in here: chrysanthemum, all these different lavenders.
So some of these are making it into your meads, and some of these are just...
Not yet, no.
Not
Most
yet.
of them, like, we're
Just
looking forward to using them.
Yeah.
But they're mostly like one or two of each kind. We're just trying to figure out what grows well
Yeah,
up
yeah.
here and what we can use. So the geraniums, like, this is the first year we've had enough of them, but you know, they're so varied. Like this one, it's not new. You can smell this. This is like a, you know, like
Camera smell.
camera smell. Yeah. And this is cool too, and then we use them for garnishes at the bar.
Okay.
So like, this is probably a sweet marjoram, but you know, it has these wonderful flowers that we can use for garnishes. So that's fun.
Cool.
Yeah. Amaranth,
Beautiful.
calendula. Yeah, we got a whole kidney,
It's a
bunch
nice
of Greek herbs.
Little green oasis in the middle of Brooklyn.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's really cool.
Our roots.
Yeah. Awesome. So is 1 year like a good average for all of your meads for aging?
Yeah, that's kind of like where, I mean, if we're on top of it at the year, if we're kind of like behind, then it'll be a little bit more. But yeah, there's a seasonality to some of this stuff, but
Right.
also, I mean, you could drink this stuff after 6 months,
Right.
be fine.
Right.
But it goes from like a B+ to an A if you can give it another 6 months.
Yeah, which a B+ is great, except we want to
Yeah,
be
yeah, we want to be
A's
A.
better.
We're
A's better.
we're nerds.
Yeah.
So we want to have A. Straight A meadery.
Straight A meadery.
Yeah. So that's and I think that's the main difference, especially for homebrewers. They're used to making things in a few weeks,
Right.
which again is fine for beer. But if you really want to make great mead, the best thing to do is make a lot of it and hide half of it. You know, put it on your bed, forget about it. Make enough that you're not like drinking it because you don't feel like going to the store to get beer.
So before we talk about some tips for home brewers, is there anything else you want to say about Enlightenment Meads? Maybe who your clientele is, or speak a little bit about the CSA.
Sure.
Because I feel like that's an interesting. A lot of people have heard of CSAs for vegetables, but not for meads.
Right. Well, I started the first a wine CSA, I think, or mead CSA, like almost 10 years ago. And when I started, it was mostly that. But actually, it's a common practice in wineries.
Okay.
organized a little bit different because legally it's kind of complicated to pay for something before you buy it, like with wine.
Right.
But essentially it's a subscription service, and the idea is that we want to get, what's nice about the CSA model or community-supported alcohol is that there's a very short distance between the consumer and the producer. And that it's not just like a relationship based on price, meaning like if you make it cheap enough, someone will buy it. If it's too expensive, they don't. Like the relationship is more about trust. So they invest in you. They say, I'm going to be committed to what you make. And so our members are sort of committed for a year. They say, I'm going to be a member for a year. And in exchange, every like 3 or 4 months, we send them a box of mead. And it'll be 4 bottles of whatever is seasonal. But we give it to them at like a lower price because they're committing. And also we often include things that aren't available to the public, which is really nice. So we did a spruce tip mead with a holographic label that was very popular. I was interviewed by a Japanese company, a Japanese TV station like 2 years ago, and I made a mead for them from like wild stuff. And you know, we never bottled it, it's upstate and it's finally ready, and like, okay, we only gonna be able to make, I made a small batch, so we're probably only gonna have like 100 bottles. So that'll go for the club. And the only way you can get it is be part of the club. So, and because our bottles often sell out, you know, we sort of have a pricing model where when they come out, there's around $25. But then when we're only down to a few cases, we need to serve them at the bar, so they get more expensive. And by joining the CSA, you always get guaranteed that you're going to get one, which is sort of nice.
Right.
Yeah, but mostly it means that like they trust me to make something good. I try not to disappoint them, and it's a more intimate relationship, you know.
Great.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so basically you're racking the Fay. The Fay is which one? The one with dandelions?
With cider apples.
With cider apples, okay. And you're racking that from here, from this bin to this bin. Mm-hmm. Was it ever in a barrel?
It was in barrels upstate, I believe. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, so you're putting it, so it was in a barrel, then you put it in here, and now you're racking it in there.
We rack it last before we bottle so that it's as clear as possible.
Right, as clear as possible. So when are you going to bottle? How long will it be in the other bin before you bottle it? Like
we're bottling
today. Oh, okay, yeah. So you're just racking it like right before bottling.
Yeah, because you can see, if you look down here, you can start seeing the sediment form that was left down there.
Lees. Oh wow! Hey, so what do y'all do with all the extra lees?
Most of it gets dumped out. Sometimes we'll save a lot if it still has a lot of wine in it.
Okay.
Let it settle again. I should show you all the carboys in the back. You'll see what it means.
Oh, cool. Now, these big things have been sterilized?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. And this pump is the one that helps you rack. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, you're not doing like a little siphon tube.
Well, it's similar actually. It's an air-powered pump.
Okay.
So it's very gentle. It's a diaphragm that kind of collapses. But you know, also like, I don't know if Holly walked me through. So before we start, she'll wash this thing down. This is our bottler, and you know, it's clean, but it's not really quite sterile. I mean, it's not. You wouldn't want to do surgery with it.
Right.
But this is one of the advantages of doing higher alcohol, like standard strength wines. That the wine, when it's at 12.5% or 13%, it's already a kind of antibacterial agent.
Right.
So when you make low alcohol meads, you know, the requirement for sterility goes up quite a bit. But when you're making these kind of aged natural wines, you can use natural processes. You don't need a lot of chemicals.
So you only bring out these big, like, these things, these containers I'm seeing, like, on bottling day.
Yeah, we try not to. Sometimes things will go in there, like to settle before we bottle, just because they're easy to move around and roll around.
Yeah,
but
that's wheels.
When we run out of space.
Yeah, and they're light. I mean, if you are thinking about making fermentation on a large scale,
Right.
I mean, you can buy a used barrel for like $100.
Oh, really?
A good one.
Do you ever rack from one barrel to another
Yeah,
barrel?
sure, all the time. It's just a little bit Yeah, we do it constantly. And these barrels, do we have any empty ones here?
Yeah, on the bottom two right there.
These?
Yeah, 16I and the one next on the right.
All of these barrels used to be red wine barrels, like.
Yes, we have new ones. These are whites.
Okay. Oh, these are whites. So, what meads are you going to age in the white one?
I'm going to do the Floralia, which is a botanical mead. And
Okay.
then I'm going to do an experiment with our normal knot, which is usually has red wine.
Right.
But I'm going to do 2 barrels of white just to see.
Ooh, cool.
Yeah, just see how it goes.
Okay. And these barrels are from like a winery that closed, or they didn't.
No, there's a whole industry of reselling barrels.
Barrels.
So barrels for most winemakers are more valuable when they're new.
I see.
And then what happens is over time the oak gets extracted out, and then they become what they call neutral.
Uh-huh.
But a neutral barrel doesn't mean it's the same as a glass tank. It just means it's not flavoring the wine with oak.
Right.
But it still will breathe.
Yeah.
And because it's round, it will circulate the wine.
Uh-huh.
So it's a much more efficient process, and it's everything just tastes better in them.
Uh-huh.
So when they're neutral, they've been used sometimes 10, 12 years.
Okay.
Over and over again. So they've been fully extracted, and then we get them. And surprisingly, there's still sometimes a little hint of wood, but for me, when I've worked with like newer barrels, the wood was really overpowering.
Right.
So I like them neutral, so it's a good relationship, so they get recycled.
So when you said 10 to 12 years, you mean like 10 to 12 years, and then we consider them neutral, and that's when you start using them?
No, it has
or
to do with how many times they've been emptied.
oh, how many times they've been emptied?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so like 10 times, 8 times. And they'll tell you where they're from, and they'll tell you what the toast is.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So you use them once once they've been considered neutral.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes sense. You don't necessarily want an oak flavor for your, yeah. And there's micro-oxidization happening because of the.
Yeah, which is it's not subtle. It's a big deal. You'll notice it because we'll often make a little bit extra and put them in glass carboys.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually silk screened these last week.
Okay.
And then they're water-based inks, so they take about a week to dry properly. So it's the process of bottling takes like a month to get. You have to imagine you have to buy the bottles. They have to get shipped here. You got to meet them. You need the caps. You need the corks. You need the stickers. You need the labels. You need here's the bottle.
It's really beautiful. That's your design, right?
It's my friend's drawing, but yeah, I guess it's my design.
Okay.
I decided to use it, and then that's the back.
Beautiful.
So, and all of this is highly legislated, so you have to get this approved, every single word, every period, and you have to do that in advance. So that's annoying.
Okay. Yeah. It's bureaucracy.
Okay, so Holly, we're going to be using, make sure that you want the end to be underneath the liquid, because at this stage, what's much more dangerous than bacteria, because the assumption is it's wild, it already has bacteria in it, is I don't want to aerate it. I want to have as little oxygen in the process as possible. So now I just bubbled in a bunch of stuff, but so theoretically you want that end, you want both ends under the liquid the whole time. Now when you use a centrifugal pump that spins, it really beats up the wine. You can taste it. It's sort of like, it would be like if you just shook it in a bottle for like half an hour. It's really hard on it. This is the most gentle of the pumps because it's really just a diaphragm opening and closing.
Okay.
That's it. So what we have here is we have a little bit extra that gets into the barrel. Often we'll make extra to top off the barrels because they'll dehydrate and you'll lose a gallon or two. And then if you want to look, you can kind of see here. It's still cloudy, but that's mostly protein and it's not necessarily yeast. Right? So you can see the drip tube coming down. And then one of the tricks I'll do that I think you can do at home too is you slowly lower this, and then when you get towards the end, I don't want to suck up this stuff from the bottom.
Right.
So I'm going to roll this. I'm gonna roll the carboy a little bit
Uh-huh.
to keep it under the liquid. And then right when it starts to get cloudy, I'll stop.
Stop it.
So that's what we call being conservative. I'm not gonna pick up any of the yeast. If it's in, so can you turn that off? Just,
Sure. Where does it go? Oh, yeah.
because I don't want to pump air through it.
Right.
Hey, actually, you want to grab this?
Or,
What, the ones in here?
yeah,
It's the same stuff that's in there.
it just hasn't been aged
It's
in the
just like,
barrel.
no, it's all been aged in a barrel.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Basically, I was all aged upstate, and I brought it down in the plastic
Oh,
so that we
okay.
do the bottling down here.
Okay.
The issue is that I don't have a barrel. I don't have a container that's like 16 gallons, which
Right.
is what the extra is.
Right.
So I want to reduce I want to reduce the oxygen,
Right.
especially on the finished wine.
Right.
So I can fill these up really tightly. I could have put it in a keg, a big keg, you know, but this is already how we do it. Also, I wanted it to settle, and this also gives me, because it's clear, I can really get a
Right,
sense
you
of
can-
how much sediment is in it. And this was sort of the last of a series of them, so it's got the most leaves in it.
Uh-huh.
Because what I'll do is, for example, to be efficient so we don't waste anything, like that stuff that was at the bottom of the barrel,
Right.
which looked muddy and gross, I'll keep adding it to this thing, and it'll eventually settle out, and then you can reclaim a bunch of it.
Okay.
If I was a big commercial winery, they'll actually press it. If you want to have a corking machine, like a machine that actually puts the things in for you, you know, it's like $5,000.
Right.
We would have to use it all the time or really large runs, and it wouldn't pay for the labor it saves for like 10 years, and by then we need something bigger. So the nice thing about using these is that they're manually inserted, and you don't need a machine for them. They're very expensive, but
You can reuse
we can reuse them, which is cool. People at home can reuse them. Home brewers can reuse them, and that's great. And also, it's sort of like everything we do is by hand. So, like, unless you're making, you know, I don't know what we're doing this year, maybe 5,000 gallons. That sound right? I have no
Today?
idea. No, in general.
Oh.
I mean, if we run that thing twice a month, yeah, it'd be like 5,000 gallons. So that would be maximum. At that scale, like the machines there's not like a lot of equipment that's between a really big commercial meadery
Right.
and a home brewer.
Right.
So like home brewers own this thing. Like the next thing up, like, is a whole bottling line.
Right.
So we end up using this kind of in between equipment, which
This
is okay.
is particularly for glass.
No, this is just to shrink the
shrink.
PVC.
Okay.
Now, the question is, what is this really for?
Right.
Right?
I mean, to
Well, it
protect
does.
the
It
cap,
does a few
hold
things.
it in place.
No, it does a few things. One thing is that if this got wet or moisture, like you might get a little mold here. So that's why a lot of corks are capped.
Right.
Even like cork bottles, old ones. It's aesthetic. It's so you don't see in there. But also it has to do with the fact that like sometimes you'll get like a little scum on the inside. So it covers it up. But for us, it's pretty hard to knock these off. But you could theoretically do it if you hit it just the right way. So this also keeps it on and shows that it's not been opened. So that's required by law, actually.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, you have to have something that shows it. Because otherwise you can pop these out, put your strychnine in it, and close it back up.
Red Hook Winery just corks them. They don't put heat shrink on them.
They're supposed to. It may be that because they're using corks, and you can tell whether or not it's been pulled out. But because you can't tell on these, you have to seal it.
So there's no, you literally just pop that in. There's no like suction, you know.
No, they're just very cleverly designed.
Thank you for your time, Raphael.
okay.
You're doing really great things here, and your mead tastes wonderful. And I guess that's the most important thing. You know?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.